Thousands of years before anyone called it Carolina, this land already had a name. The Catawba people lived in the hills, the Cherokee ruled the mountains, and the Cusabo fished the coast. For 10,000 years, this was their world. Then the Spanish came, 1521, looking for gold. They found swamps, mosquitoes, disease. No gold. They left. The French tried too, failed. This land wasn't ready to be taken. Not yet. 1670, the English had a different plan. 8 rich lords, one wild idea. Build a colony, get rich, simple. But who would actually go? Barbados planters, tough, ruthless. They brought everything, including slavery. April 1670. Ships arrived. They called it Charlestown, for the king. First summer, half of them died. But the survivors? They stayed. And then came the pirates. Blackbeard himself blockaded the harbor. He held the whole town hostage. For a week, the colonists paid. Blackbeard left, 1718. Time to fight back. They hunted pirates, captured dozens, and hanged them, all at once. With the pirates gone, the colonists asked themselves one question. How do we get rich? The answer was growing right beneath their feet. Rice. It grew perfectly in these swamps. Europe couldn't get enough of it. But growing rice? Backbreaking, deadly. No white colonist would do it. So they looked across the ocean, to West Africa, where people had grown rice for generations. They didn't ask. They took. Ships arrived in Charlestown Harbor, packed with human beings, mothers, fathers, children, torn from everything they knew. Charlestown became the largest slave port in North America. 40% of all enslaved Africans brought to America came through this harbor. By 1720, black people outnumbered white people, 2 to 1, in some areas 9 to 1. South Carolina was an African colony run by a white minority. The work was brutal, standing in flooded fields, sunburning, snakes everywhere, malaria killing thousands. But the rice kept growing, and the money kept flowing. The planters became fabulously wealthy, the richest people in all of British America. They built mansions, wore London fashion, sent their sons to England for education. Charleston became the wealthiest city in the colonies. Grand balls every week, theater, music. They called themselves the Carolina aristocracy. But in the slave quarters, a different culture was being born. African traditions survived. Languages blended into something new. They called it Gula, 1739. The enslaved had had enough. At Stono River, 20 Africans grabbed weapons and began marching south, toward freedom, toward Spanish Florida. More joined, then more. Nearly 100 strong. They burned plantations, killed slave owners, chanting liberty. For one day they were free, but the militia came, with horses, with guns. The rebellion was crushed by nightfall. The leaders executed, their heads placed on posts along the highway. A warning. After Stono, the laws got harsher. No drums, no gathering, no reading, no hope of freedom. South Carolina would never let that happen again. The rice kept growing, the money kept coming. By 1760, South Carolina was the richest colony in America, built on the backs of people who would never see a penny. They thought this would last forever. They were wrong, because across the ocean, a king was about to make a big mistake. And Geo? Well, partner, this is where it gets really interesting. Because South Carolina, they weren't just going to fight for independence. They were going to lead the charge. 1765. King George needed money. The wars in Europe had emptied his treasury, so he looked at his American colonies and said, time to pay up. The Stamp Act. Every document taxed. Every newspaper. Every playing card. The colonists were furious. But South Carolina, they were the angriest of all. They burned the stamps, chased the tax collectors out of town, wore homespun clothes to boycott British goods. These rice planters were ready for a fight. 1776, the Declaration of Independence. 4 South Carolinians signed it, and now there was no turning back. This was war. The British came for Charleston first, June 1776. 9 warships, 2,000 soldiers. They thought it would be easy. They were very, very wrong. Fort Sullivan, built from palmetto logs, soft, spongy wood. The British laughed at it, but Colonel Moultrie had a plan. Sometimes soft is exactly what you need. The British opened fire, hundreds of cannonballs, but the palmetto wood didn't shatter. The balls just sank into the soft logs and stuck there, harmless. Moultrie's men fired back all day long. They sank 1 ship, crippled 3 more. The mighty British Navy, humiliated by a log fort and some farmers. The British retreated, first American victory of the Revolution. The palmetto tree became South Carolina's symbol forever. Still on their flag today, but the British weren't finished. 1780, they came back, this time with overwhelming force. Charleston fell after a brutal siege, the worst American defeat of the entire war. 5,000 American soldiers captured, the entire Southern Army. Gone. The British thought they had won. They controlled Charleston. They controlled the coast, but they didn't control the backcountry. The Swamp Fox, Francis Marion. He refused to surrender. With a band of guerrilla fighters, he vanished into the swamps and made the British miserable. Hit and run, strike at night, burn supply wagons, free prisoners, then vanish before the British could react. They couldn't catch him. They couldn't stop him. South Carolina became a civil war within the Revolution. Neighbor against neighbor, loyalist against patriot, families torn apart, farms burned, no mercy on either side. More Revolutionary War battles were fought in South Carolina than any other colony. Over 200 engagements. This state bled more than any other for independence. 1781. Cowpens. American General Morgan set a trap. He put his weakest troops in front, let them fire twice, then retreat. The British thought they were winning. They weren't. The hidden Continental Army rose up, caught the British completely by surprise, surrounded, slaughtered. A masterpiece of military tactics. 1783. The war was over. America was free. British ships sailed out of Charleston Harbor for the last time. South Carolina had paid the price in blood, but they had won. The war was over, but South Carolina was in ruins. Plantations burned, fields abandoned, the rice economy shattered. They needed something new. Then came the cotton gin. 1793. Eli Whitney's little machine changed everything. Suddenly, cotton was profitable, incredibly profitable. Cotton exploded across South Carolina. Every planter switched crops. The upcountry, the Midlands, everywhere. White gold, they called it. But cotton needed labor, massive amounts of labor. And that meant one thing: more slavery. The slave trade had been banned, so they bred slaves instead. Charleston became the center of the domestic slave trade. Families ripped apart, sold to different plantations, husbands from wives, children from mothers. Pure evil. But in the North, something was changing. Abolitionists, people who said slavery was a sin, that it must end. South Carolina heard them and refused to listen. 1832. South Carolina made a threat. Federal laws we don't like, we simply won't follow them. We'll leave the Union if we have to. President Andrew Jackson didn't blink. He threatened to send the army, to hang the traitors himself. South Carolina backed down, this time, but the anger didn't go away. It grew. Every year the North got more powerful, more industrial, more opposed to slavery. South Carolina felt surrounded. Charleston's elite built their mansions higher, threw their parties louder, defended slavery more fiercely, pretending everything was fine. It wasn't. In the slave quarters, whispers spread. Freedom might be coming. Someday, they waited. They hoped. They endured. 1850, a compromise. California enters free, but a new fugitive slave law. Escaped slaves must be returned, even from the North. The abolitionists were furious. South Carolina smiled. They had won this round. But the tension was building. Something had to break. Someone had to blink. And no one in South Carolina planned to blink. They'd rather burn it all down than give up their way of life. And that's exactly what they would do. 1859. A man named John Brown raided a federal armory. His plan? Arm the slaves. Start a revolution. He failed. He was hanged. But South Carolina panicked. In the North, some called John Brown a hero, a martyr. In South Carolina, they saw something terrifying. The North wanted to destroy them. War was coming. November 1860. Abraham Lincoln elected president. He wasn't even on the ballot in South Carolina. They refused to recognize him. The Republican, the abolitionist. December 20th, 1860. South Carolina voted, unanimous. 169-0. They were leaving the United States of America, first state out. Church bells rang across Charleston. Cannons fired in celebration. Strangers hugged in the streets. They thought they were free. They had no idea what was coming. But there was a problem. In Charleston Harbor, a small island, Fort Sumter, federal property, manned by Union soldiers, still flying the American flag, right in their harbor. Major Robert Anderson, 85 Union soldiers, surrounded, cut off from supplies. Lincoln faced a choice: abandon the fort or resupply it and risk war. Lincoln chose to resupply. He sent ships. South Carolina saw this as an act of war. They gave Anderson an ultimatum: surrender the fort or we open fire. April 12, 1861, 4:30 in the morning, still dark. The Confederate batteries opened fire, the first shots of the Civil War. For 34 hours, the bombardment continued. Over 3,000 shells. Fort Sumter burned. Walls crumbled, but Anderson held on until he couldn't anymore. April 14th, Anderson surrendered. Remarkably, no one had died in the battle, but that was about to change, because now it was truly war. Charleston celebrated again. They had won. They had beaten the United States. Little did they know, they had just started the bloodiest war in American history. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. The North answered, and they were angry. South Carolina had fired first. Now the Union would fire back. 600,000 Americans would die in the next 4 years, more than every other American war combined. In South Carolina, they would pay the highest price of all. At first, South Carolina watched the war from a distance. The big battles were in Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania. Charleston sent its sons north to fight. Many never came back. The Union Navy blockaded the coast. No more cotton going out. No more goods coming in. Charleston, once the richest city in America, began to starve. The Union bombarded Charleston for nearly 2 years, the longest siege in the war. Shells fell day and night. Families fled. Those who stayed lived in terror. But the real nightmare was coming from the west. General William Tecumseh Sherman. He had burned Atlanta. Now he marched toward the sea, and then he turned north, toward South Carolina. Sherman hated South Carolina. They started this war, he said. Now they would feel its full fury. He told his men, make them howl. February 1865, 60,000 Union soldiers crossed into South Carolina. They burned everything: farms, barns, houses, cotton gins. If it could burn, it burned. Columbia, the state capital, burned to the ground. Who started the fire? Both sides blamed each other. It didn't matter. The city was ash. For the enslaved, Sherman's army meant one thing: freedom. Thousands followed the Union troops, walking away from the plantations, finally free. February 18th. Union troops entered Charleston, the city that fired the first shot, the heart of secession, fallen without a fight. The Confederates had already fled. Black soldiers led the march into Charleston, former slaves now wearing Union blue, marching through the streets where their parents had been sold. Sweet, bitter justice. April 9th, 1865. Lee surrendered in Virginia. The war was over. South Carolina lay in ruins. Plantations destroyed. Cities burned. A generation of young men dead. 1 in 5 white South Carolina men of military age were dead. The economy destroyed. The slaves freed. Everything they had fought for, gone. They had truly lost. And then on April 14th, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Any hope for gentle reconstruction died with him. The hard times were just beginning. South Carolina had started this war with cannons and celebration. 4 years later, they stood in ashes. They had fired the first shot and lost everything. After the war, 4 million enslaved people were suddenly free. But free to do what? They had no land, no money, no education, freedom without opportunity. The Freedmen's Bureau tried to help. Schools opened. For the first time, black children learned to read. Black men voted. Black politicians were elected. For a brief moment, hope. South Carolina elected black legislators, black sheriffs. A black man even served as lieutenant governor. The old plantation owners watched in horror. Their world turned upside down. But the old powers weren't finished. They organized in secret. White robes, burning crosses, the Ku Klux Klan, terror in the night. They murdered black voters, burned schoolhouses, threatened anyone who challenged white rule. Vote wrong, and your house burns. Speak up, and you disappear. 1876. Federal troops finally left. Reconstruction was over, and everything changed overnight. The gains were stripped away, the hope crushed. Jim Crow laws, separate schools, separate water fountains, separate everything. Black citizens pushed to the margins. Voting made nearly impossible. Second-class citizenship enforced by law. Sharecropping replaced slavery. Work the white man's land. Pay with your crop. Go into debt. Stay in debt forever. A different kind of chain, almost as unbreakable. The old plantation class clawed back to power. But the wealth was gone. The cotton economy never recovered. South Carolina became the poorest state in America. Textile mills opened. Cheap labor. Long hours, children working. But at least it was work. Poor whites and poor blacks, both desperate, both trapped. Many black families left. The Great Migration north, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, anywhere but here, seeking freedom that South Carolina refused to give. Those who stayed endured, built churches, built communities, kept their culture alive. Gullah traditions passed down, waiting for justice, knowing it would come, someday. By 1900, South Carolina was frozen in time, still fighting the Civil War in their minds, still clinging to the old ways, still refusing to change. The 20th century had begun. The rest of America was moving forward. South Carolina was standing still. But nothing stands still forever. Change was coming, ready or not. 1917. America entered the Great War. South Carolina's sons marched off again, black and white, fighting for a country that didn't treat them equally. They came home as veterans, heroes, black soldiers who had fought for democracy, expected to finally receive it. They were wrong. Nothing had changed. The 1920s roared elsewhere. South Carolina stayed poor. Cotton prices collapsed. Boll weevils destroyed crops. Farmers black and white lost everything. The Great Depression hit hard. But South Carolina barely noticed. They were already at the bottom. You can't fall when you're already on the ground. 1941. Pearl Harbor. Another war. Again, South Carolina answered the call. Parris Island trained Marines. Charleston built ships. Everyone sacrificed. After World War II, things began to shift. Slowly, the federal government started to push. In 1947, Jackie Robinson broke baseball's color barrier. Change was in the air. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. The Supreme Court ruled segregated schools are unconstitutional. South Carolina refused to comply. For years, but the movement grew. Sit-ins began. Young black students sat at white-only lunch counters, refused to leave, got arrested, got beaten, kept coming back. The whole nation watched. Television brought the truth into living rooms. Fire hoses, police dogs, the ugliness of segregation exposed for all to see. 1963. Harvey Gantt became the first black student at Clemson University. No violence. South Carolina wanted to avoid another Alabama. Progress through pressure. 1964. The Civil Rights Act. 1965. The Voting Rights Act. Federal law finally enforcing what the Constitution had promised 100 years before. But progress came with pain. 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated. Cities burned across America. The movement lost its greatest voice, but not its spirit. Schools finally integrated. First a few, then more. Black children and white children in the same classrooms. Awkward at first, but children adapt faster than their parents. The economy slowly improved. Military bases brought jobs. Tourism discovered the beaches. Air conditioning made the South livable. People started moving in, not just out. By 1970, the old South Carolina was finally dying. Segregation crumbling, economy growing, new people with new ideas, a different state emerging, slowly, painfully, but emerging. But the past doesn't disappear. It echoes. The Confederate flag still flew over the State House. The wound still open. The work not finished, not even close. The last 50 years transformed South Carolina. The sleepy, poor, backward state woke up. Industry came. People came. The population doubled. A new South Carolina was born. BMW built their American factory here. Boeing, Volvo, Michelin. Good jobs replaced the cotton fields. South Carolina became a manufacturing powerhouse. Charleston became a tourist destination. Beautiful old city. Amazing food. Beaches nearby. People from everywhere came to visit. Came to stay. The city bloomed again. But the old wounds remained. The Confederate flag still flew at the State House. For many white South Carolinians, heritage. For black South Carolinians, a symbol of terror and oppression. June 17, 2015, a Wednesday night. Bible study at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. Mother Emanuel, the oldest black church in the South. A stranger had joined them. They welcomed him, gave him a seat, prayed with him. For an hour, then he stood up and murdered 9 people because of the color of their skin. The killer wanted to start a race war. He wanted South Carolina to burn. Instead, something unexpected happened, something that changed everything. At the killer's hearing, the families of the victims spoke. They looked at the man who murdered their mothers, their fathers, their children, and they said, "I forgive you." The world expected riots. They got grace, and that grace changed South Carolina. Because now, finally, the debate about that flag was over. July 10, 2015. 150 years after the Civil War ended, the Confederate flag came down from the South Carolina State House. Finally, the crowd erupted. Tears, cheers. A century and a half of pain and one moment of release. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Something real. Something that mattered. South Carolina today, still complicated, still divided in some ways, still struggling with its history, but also growing, changing, trying, more diverse than ever before. The Gullah Geechee culture survives. African traditions carried for 400 years. Language, food, art, sweet grass baskets still woven by hands that learn from hands that learn from hands brought from Africa. The beaches still stretch golden. The palmetto trees still sway. The history still echoes in every street, every church, every field. You can't escape history here. You can only face it. From the first Native Americans fishing these shores, to the enslaved who built this state with their suffering, to the soldiers who fought and died on both sides, to the freedom fighters who refused to quit. This is South Carolina, the state that started the Civil War, the state that's still healing from it, the state that showed the world what grace looks like, the Palmetto State, built on pain, torn apart by war, rising slowly from the ashes, still rising, still becoming. The story isn't over, it's just another chapter, and that was South Carolina in the Civil War, the state that fired the first shot, the state that paid the highest price,